Good morning, everyone. My name is Al Tyree. I'm the partner manager here at ERP Suites. Thank you for attending our webinar session, Terribly Exposed, How to Avoid Flashing Your JD Edwards Data in Public. A little bit about ERP Suites. We provide comprehensive technology solutions to help companies not just identify IT potential, but realize IT. Our advisory practice provides services and products utilizing JD Edwards orchestration and process automation. Our cloud services, we are a cloud partner with AWS, OCI, Microsoft Azure, and we also provide a private ERP cloud solution. Managed services, we extend your internal capabilities with CNC and JD Edwards application support. And our consulting services includes our JD Edwards security practice and end-to-end network security. A little bit about our partner, ALLOut Security. If you haven't heard of them already, ALLOut offers a market-leading solution for automating and streamlining security, audit, and compliance. The solution works directly in your JD Edwards environment, offering much-needed functionality that standard JDE does not. For example, using ALLOut, you can get quick, audible reporting, accelerate day-to-day security maintenance, and even automate role conflict resolution. If you're going through a security redesign, they also offer out-of-the-box segregation of duties, roles, and menus, alongside other tools to help expedite your project. Now allow me to introduce and present Linda Nelson, Business Service Director, ALLOut Security, Paul Shear, Executive Director, Cloud ERP Suites. Both Linda and Paul are well known for their expertise and JD Edwards knowledge in the JD Edwards community. And it is my pleasure to have them as our joint presenters this morning. Linda and Paul, take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, Al. So I want to start out with a safe harbor statement about security in general. So the main thing to take away from this presentation, or not take away from this presentation rather, is thinking that security is just a one-time event, that you're going to watch this presentation, you're going to get a checklist of items, and then if you do these checklist of items, you're secure. That's not the case. It's a continual exercise. One other thing I want to call out is that migrating JD Edwards to the cloud, no matter what all those salespeople may tell you, does not automatically make it secure. You're responsible for securing it in the cloud. Now, the cloud does give you an awesome framework and tools to help make it secure, but the responsibility is on you to execute and make sure that you're using that tool set to secure the environment as best you can. So the agenda for the webinar today is we're going to talk about 4 different things. So the first 2 kind of very briefly, just framing up the conversation. What's the nature of the threat that we're all facing? What's the costs associated with data breaches? Where we're going to spend most of our time, though, is focused on this 3rd bullet, vectors of attack. So how are people going about attacking and exfiltrating data out of JD Edwards? And then lastly, kind of putting it all together, summarizing everything that we've gone over. So let's start out talking about what are the consequences if the data that you have within JD Edwards becomes public. So listed on the screen, we've got kind of lots of different categories: customer data, personnel data records, suppliers, financials, bill of material, cost of goods sold. Hey, Linda, what do you think about the idea of this type of data getting exposed?
Well, Paul, it's when you start looking at it, I mean, my background is in audit and compliance. So I've lived in a world where having your financial data exposed introduces both competitive risk as well as risk associated with SEC filings and penalties and private, confidential data that's exposed. But when you start looking at your cost of goods, your bill of material, your product knowledge. There's huge opportunity cost to making that information public that is associated with those pieces of data that give you a competitive advantage. Um, Even taking it further, when you look at compliance activities, GDPR, HIPAA, you've got HR information in there, you've got banking information in there, you've got financial information. So there's both opportunity costs associated with with exposing that information, but there's also real compliance costs, whether it's associated with the cost of putting mitigations in place if you lose some of that some of that confidential information, or fines and penalties that come along with that. So there's real costs and intangible costs associated with this data becoming public that shouldn't.
Hey, Linda, I know when we were practicing for this webinar earlier, you were talking about an executive that you previously worked for. And I died laughing when he characterized your job as you were supposed to keep him out of jail.
That was
And
that
just kind
much.
of looking at a lot of this. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah, that was what he defined my job. I was responsible for the controls and compliance environment around a multi-ERP system, and he said, "Your job is to keep me out of jail," and that was our CFO. And this is real.
Yeah, and the reality is you can never make systems perfectly secure. But if data breaches do occur, you need to be able to demonstrate that you did everything humanly possible to protect this data, or you're accepting all kinds of personal liability as executives of these companies, not to mention just the damage to your corporate brand, your reputation, and the impact to your shareholders. So I want to shift now and talk a little bit about the nature of the threat and how this has changed over the last decade. So kind of at the beginning of the decade, if you look at the guy in the upper left-hand corner, this is who we were concerned with. You know, his profile was he lived in his mom's basement. He probably worked at a pizzeria. And at night, he spent his time trying to penetrate these systems for kicks, just to see if he could get in, if he could poke around. He was more of a nuisance than any real true business impact. The reality is he's no longer who we're concerned with. Who we're concerned with are nation states that are trying to penetrate systems. So whether we're talking about foreign actors that are trying to get copies of your business data, copies of who your customers are, your suppliers are, etc., and giving that to local competitors as part of what they consider economic security. How do they make their economy more resilient? Or to the other end of the spectrum, what about domestically? The NSA. We know that they're going out there trying to look at systems as well. So this is kind of the new normal. This is what you've got to be worried about in terms of protecting these systems. So now shifting gears, let's talk about what happens when you actually have a data breach. So what's the average cost associated with that data breach in 2020? Well, IBM has published some very interesting statistics. So if you're a company and you have compromised credentials in the case of those credentials getting out, that's going to result in $4.7 million of impact. Let's say you have third-party software. We think about what happened with SolarWinds back in 2020. So maybe you're using that to monitor your systems, and there were exploits that were built into that software. $4.5 million of attack or of impact. And by the way, SolarWinds just being an example, not saying that the actual impact of those specific organizations were exactly that dollar amount. But the one that really gets me most interested is the misconfiguration of the cloud. Something really, really easy to do, especially if your organization is relatively new to hyperscale clouds. $4.4 million of impact. I mean, so these are things that you do not have budget setting there to deal with when they happen. and this
And
flows
Paul,
directly to your organization's bottom line.
Paul, one thing that, a lot of organizations look at this and they say, we're small. This doesn't apply to us. This is significant. What you don't realize is the cost of these breaches is really a multi-year cost. It is long reaching. You may have to put in 5 years of risk mitigation efforts and tools in place. There's lost ownership costs, there's lost stockholder costs. It is very easy to add up to $4 million that you don't even realize. So I don't think these numbers are just associated with large organizations.
That's an excellent point, Wanda. So let's get into talking about the vectors of attack. So the first one, and kind of being a little bit playful here, it pays to advertise. And I'm going to talk about something which is security through obscurity. And anyone with a security background right now is cringing, because this is the worst way to protect your system from a security standpoint. But it's also really easy to implement, and there's some good reasons for doing it. And we'll talk about why here in just a second. So before we get into kind of that detail, I want to frame it up this way. Someone somewhere out there does not like you, does not like your organization, does not like your mission. This doesn't matter whether you're on the left, whether you're on the right, whether you're up, whether you're down, whatever spectrum of the political compass that you might be on. There's somebody out there that's fundamentally opposed to your existence. So why is this kind of a big deal? Well, for companies that are running JD Edwards, you can literally use a search engine and find the login pages. So in this case, just went out, typed in JD Edwards login, and you can see kind of the list of auto completes that it gives. If I get a little bit more specific, in this case, I'm on Bing and I type in e1menu.map. Here's a list of a whole bunch of URLs where if I click on those URLs, it's going to immediately pull up those users' systems. Hey, Linda, you were telling me a story earlier about when you did this live on a webinar. Can you share that now?
Oh, absolutely. I included this slide for that reason. It was traditionally when I talk about this in a webinar, I'll jump online, I'll just QBE or not QBE, tells you how much time I spend in JD Edwards. I will just do a quick query for e1menu.maf. I did this in a webinar. I brought up the list. I just randomly clicked on one of them and was able to use the standard JD Edwards system ID that we'll talk about in a few minutes, and JDE, and was able to access their production environment. I could not believe that I just demonstrated on a live webinar how simple it was to access this organization's production JD Edwards environment with wide open access. I did after that. As soon as the webinar ended, I called the company, found some contacts, and was able to make a point of letting them know that they needed to lock down their system and gave them some advice on how to do that.
That story just absolutely makes my blood run cold. I mean, you cannot get any easier way of accessing the systems than it's already on the internet, and you can use a default username and password to get in. That is just scary stuff.
Yeah, it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to be able to hack your system in that approach.
So another common snippet of the URL is /JDE/OWHTML. You'll get a bunch of hits off of that, or even going after Orchestrator itself. So what do we suggest to kind of protect and mitigate against this? Well, not on the list, but if at all possible, just don't put this stuff on the internet to begin with. There's no better security than not exposing it in the first place. Now, we recognize that some customers, due to their business models, this is kind of an absolute requirement. They have to. So a couple suggestions there. One is restrict the subnets that are allowed to access that public URL. Now, there's still things that can get around that, like IP spoofing, etc. But it's sort of like putting the club on your car, if you remember that from the 90s. It doesn't make it secure, but it does make it a little bit more difficult for someone to access the system. So maybe they go on to easier prey. Another thing would be to add a meta tag for robot no search. This tells the search engines ignore me. Now, this is also kind of some limited utility because you can also go out to the search engines and search for everything that they're ignoring, and thus kind of indirectly find the results that way. But probably the biggest thing I'm suggesting here is don't use your corporate domain for logging into JD Edwards. Registering a new domain is pretty cheap. Go ahead and pick up bob123.com or whatever you want to come up with, and have that as a separate URL so that somebody looking for your JD Edwards system can't, immediately tie that to who you are. So moving on to the next threat vector, the lazy admin. And this is where you have people within your organization that are responsible for securing these systems, but are showing a lack of due diligence in how they're going about it. So we already talked about this first one with the story Linda told. By default, for years, JDE had a default password of JDE. Everybody, literally everybody in the JD Edwards ecosystem knows this. The mitigation for this is pretty straightforward. Just change the JDE password. Don't have it as a default, and possibly just disable that JD Edwards account altogether. Don't even have it out there. So, Linda, can you talk about this one?
Absolutely. One of the things that you can't always change the JD Edwards password, or you don't know if individuals have left your organization maybe that had awareness of that password and it didn't get managed, or there are other system ID passwords that might be in play in this. This is an example of a report that we have within the ALLOut tool set that is an inactive user report. And it gives you the opportunity to show user IDs that maybe haven't been used to sign in the system for a long period of time or aren't used frequently. And it's a great way to clean up user IDs that could be fraudulently used for something else. But you'll notice on that bottom row, I went ahead and displayed when was the last time this particular ID was used to sign on in my system. I could have shown how many days has it been used during this period. So if somebody is utilizing that system IT, I've got a detective control to go ahead and look to see, has anybody signed into JD Edwards with that JDE system ID? And I can tell it hasn't happened since April of 2019. So at some point, somebody was directly logging into my system with the JDE system ID. So these type of detective controls, looking for, is there activity going on? Like Paul said earlier, it's not once and done with security. So put your layers of security in place, change that JD Edwards password, but you might want to put a step in place also to say, has there been any activity around some of these system IDs that really shouldn't be being used to sign on directly to the system?
And Linda, so this report that we're looking at, is this native functionality within JD Edwards?
It isn't native functionality. It is part of the ALLOut tool set that partners with information that is collected in native JD Edwards functionality to provide reporting and additional functionality. Things like this report, while I'm using it to demonstrate the JD Edwards sign-on functionality, it can be utilized to automatically identify and disable or delete IDs that are not being utilized in the system. So in this case, Derek may have functionality to maintenance bank accounts, but he's never used it. He's the backup. Well, somebody could say, hey, I'm standing here with Derek. Can you reset his password? I need to teach him how to do something. Your IT support team, just being helpful, they say, sure. Derek's password is now password 123. Joe, who's the one who has called, has no reason to need this except he's retiring next week, and before he leaves, he wants to change the bank account on your largest supplier to his bank account, so he gets one last windfall on his way out the door. Delete those IDs, disable those
I
IDs,
can't,
take care of it.
Linda, I can't believe Joe would actually do that. I think you're just talking smack about him.
I know, but you just never know what kind of
I've known
pressures are
Joe
on
for
people.
years.
He's a good guy, but you got to watch him
All right,
sometimes. Go ahead, Paul.
That's right. So moving on to the next exploit. So a lot of passwords are actually contained within INI files. Now, in recent versions of JD Edwards, you've actually got the ability to encrypt those passwords so they're not sitting there available in clear text. You want to make sure to do that. But additionally, you want to make sure that the folder and file system that those passwords are in are secure. So for instance, on Windows, if you look at the permissions on that file, there's going to be a group listed called everyone. Everyone should not have access. Same thing for Linux. Make sure you get that locked down and secured. So Linda, what about this next one?
Absolutely. When we start looking at the idea of you can lose $4 million by having a credentials flaw, you really want to work at ensuring that you're taking every advantage to secure those credentials. So in this case, we're talking about there are some basic standard functionality built into JD Edwards that allows you to ensure the strength of some of those credentials that are in play. So whether you're looking at, depending on how you're connecting or whether you're using long IDs or not, you've got P98 OWSSEC, P98 LPSEC that have processing options in play. If you want to go ahead and move to the next slide, that give you an opportunity to require a certain strength of a password, to require accounts to be locked out if they're used repeatedly for sign-on attempts. And I always say as a best practice, set these standards consistent with it, whatever your corporate policy is on your network IDs. So you've got your JD Edwards adhering to your corporate standard policies. This is really important in ensuring that people can't try to use Derek's password by guessing, going through his 12 children's names to try to find the right name for a password. So, and that you can do things like, how long does the password need to be, and what are your, particular characters. So there's a lot of options to strengthen those credentials within your environment in standard JD Edwards functionality. Take advantage of it. In this particular screen, this is an ALLOut screen. Sits within your JD Edwards environment and gives you visibility to the users that might be in play. But in the red box, you'll notice I've highlighted some individuals that they don't have a requirement for changing their password over a particular period of time. They've got unlimited allowed attempts to be able to sign in. So again, take that next step to say, do we have users that are bypassing those standard policies that are in place? And the way this can happen is maybe in this case, Archie doesn't use the system very often. So every time he goes in, he messes up his password, locks out his account. So like we talked, we playfully use the term lazy admin, but in reality, it could just be an overwhelmed admin who gets tired of being interrupted in whatever he's doing every time Archie tries to enter the system. So he just opens up Archie's functionality so that Archie will stop calling him. In reality, what you've got is somebody or a user ID that can now bypass your standard functionalities or your standard controls. Go ahead, Paul.
So I'm imagining that from kind of like a SOX compliance reporting standpoint, this is kind of really convenient in terms of showing these are the controls and these are how we're making sure the controls are met.
It is a very simple way to check that box and again, continue to ensure the integrity of your controls that are in place.
So talking about the next exploit. So this would be a scenario where maybe one of your server admins has a personal device, and from that personal device, they're trying to connect to one of your JD Edwards servers. And you don't necessarily know what they're running for a security stack on it. Do they have antivirus? Is the antivirus updated? What are they using for malware? And their device is infected. If they connect directly to one of your JD Edwards servers with administrative privileges, they can transfer that malware off of that personal device onto your server. Really, really bad scenario. So you can now find yourself victim of ransomware, where it goes through, it encrypts your servers, no one's able to access it, or even worse, the data gets exfiltrated out of your network and sent off to some bad actor somewhere. So how do you protect yourself against that? Well, you want to make sure that you're connecting from a trusted host, or sometimes referred to as a Bastion server. So the idea is you have this locked down, you have it very secure. The admin will connect from that personal device to the Bastion server, and then from the Bastion server to your JD Edwards server. And if you're going to expose that Bastion server publicly on the internet, make sure that you're requiring two-factor authentication. And I don't have it on the slide, but another best practice is actually don't have it publicly on the internet. Require VPN access in order to get in. So you're VPNing to your network, then you're connecting to the Bastion server, and then from the Bastion server, you're jumping on to that JD Edwards host. Another exploit to be concerned with is vulnerabilities that are found in E1 tools. Now, periodically, these vulnerabilities are identified and they tend to be patched on a quarterly basis. Sometimes the patch comes out and is bundled into the latest version of tools. One of the things you'll probably hear me say it a couple times during this presentation, but please, please, please make sure that you are staying on JD Edwards maintenance and make sure that you're applying these patches when they come out. These are the only way that you can get security patches. There's a lot of vendors out there that provide third-party maintenance for JD Edwards, but they're not patching security vulnerabilities, at least as far as I'm aware. What they do is they'll provide you support for the system, which is great. They'll provide you some regulatory compliance stuff. So if there's new sets of rules that come out that you need JD Edwards to support, they'll take care of making that a reality. But what they're not doing is securing your system. And this is doubly true, doubly important if you have systems that have to be publicly exposed. You need to make sure that you're on JD Edwards maintenance. If you're not on JD Edwards maintenance, you need to get these servers off the internet. So we're talking about E1 tools here, but probably even a bigger vulnerability is WebLogic. So if you look at the CVEs that are out there that have a score of 9 or 10, and this is where bad actors are able, without any type of authenticated user access, able to take over a server. We see these come out every quarter. So as soon as Oracle releases this information, you need to immediately get your servers patched. Get this applied to protect yourself. And these particular vulnerabilities, or the patching for these vulnerabilities, you can either get that through part of your JD Edwards Oracle Tech Foundation license and the maintenance that you pay on that, or separately, you can license WebLogic directly from Oracle and pay maintenance just on this. But this is probably the single biggest thing that worries me and keeps me awake at night, are these WebLogic vulnerabilities. So make sure you're on maintenance, make sure you're keeping them patched.
Well, one of the things that folks don't think about is Oracle does a great service to us. It communicates that there are these vulnerabilities so that we have awareness, we can patch those, we can take care of those. But that also means that there are a lot of individuals out there that have at their fingertips the information that there is a vulnerability, and if you're not taking care of it, they will absolutely help you and take advantage of it. So those are widely communicated, so be aware of that.
No, that's a great point, Linda. So, some of the mitigations, obviously patching, we've already talked about that. One of the other ones is use a WAF or wide area, uh, web application firewall. So what a WAF does is you have a public load balancer, but you tell the public load balancer you're only allowed to talk to the WAF. And then the WAF sits there and proxies all of those connections. And the reality is, whenever vulnerabilities are identified, the WAF gets updated faster than you're going to be able to patch your WebLogic systems. So it acts as kind of that first layer of defense for you while you're getting all of those patches applied. And then lastly, kind of as I already said, if you can at all avoid it, just don't put your WebLogic servers directly on the internet, even in a DMZ. They really are the weakest link in your overall security profile. So one last one I want to talk about on this is unpatched vulnerabilities within the operating system and databases. There are statistics out there that say something like 70 to 80% of all exploits that are happening are things for which patches have already been released. So these aren't like, 0 day, nobody saw this coming, came out of nowhere, we're scrambling to write a patch for it. Here the patch is, apply it to your system. These are things that have been known for months, in some cases years, and admins have not applied patches to the system for these problems. So what's the mitigation for this? Well, the first is to automate the patching process. Humans really are the weak link in the chain. Anytime that anything depends on human attention and human discipline, it's a system that's prone to failure. You want to go through and you want to automate the patching process, which means that you understand how to cleanly shut JD Edwards down, how to apply the patches, how to automatically ensure the patches are there, and then how to automatically bring JD Edwards up in the correct order. And really get humans out of everything other than the approval chain for when this is going to happen and why this is, or not why, but when this is going to happen from a scheduling standpoint, to make sure that everything is coordinated with the business.
Paul, there was one question that came in from the
Oh,
community. Sorry, there's one question that came in from the audience. This idea of automating it. I guess most of us have done that manually for years. Is there a quick way to get into this automation process to make this as efficient as possible for organizations?
quick way, no, but it is something that's absolutely worth the investment. So from an ERP suite side, all of our customers we're hosting and managing their systems. This is the approach that we take with them, where the only thing we do is we have humans involved in scheduling when these are going to occur, working with our customers to make sure it doesn't have business impact, but otherwise automating that patching process. There's a lot of different frameworks out there that you can use for doing that patching, Puppet, and others. One of the other things is if you're running on a later version of JD Edwards, a lot of the stuff in terms of the startup shutdown, this can all be done via APIs now. So there's a lot of goodness in there in terms of making sure you're shutting it down cleanly, making sure that it's starting, and then in an automated fashion, actually QAing the JD Edwards application to make sure that it's up and it's successfully running. So hopefully that answered the question.
It looks like it. Thank you.
Cool. So let's talk about the leaky database. So this is where permissions are just way too broad and what you need to do to kind of ratchet that in. So we already talked about this password issue before, but JDE is not the only password that you need to be concerned with. Early on, a lot of JD Edwards installs, the database password for either, if you're SQL Server, the database owner, if you're Oracle, the schema, if you're on an AS400, the library, but the password for it was exactly the same as the username. So prod DTA, prod DTA, prod CTL, prod CTL. What you need to do is make sure all of those default passwords are getting changed. Because if somebody does have access to your infrastructure, they were able to find one box maybe that didn't get patched. They used that to get in, and then from that box, they see your database, and they're able to log into the database using one of those known credentials. So change all those default passwords, and then also use explicit firewall rules within your subnets to control what can talk directly to the database. Just because something might be setting in the same subnet or the same local area network with the database does not mean by default it should be allowed to talk. So identify what needs to talk to the database and only allow that communication to happen. And then the last thing I would suggest is monitor all database access. And this is kind of being able to put together the pieces after a breach has happened. But what this will do is give you the forensics so that you can go back and figure out how they got in and hopefully prevent that from occurring again. There's stories out there of companies where they get hacked. They don't know necessarily how they got hacked. And 3 months later, you see them in the news again because once again, the same thing happened. So the next thing to think about with the database is star public access. So by default, if you create a database user, it's going to have access to every table within JD Edwards. It's going to be able to do selects, inserts, updates, and deletes. And a lot of times you'll maybe have an interface, let's say to a Z table. And all that interface ever needs to do is an insert into that table. You need to have things locked down so that database user ID can be used for nothing else than inserting into that table. That way, if for whatever reason those credentials leak out, it really limits the surface area of damage. Oracle's published a couple of documents that tell how to do this for Oracle SQL as well as AS400 environments. So pull up those document IDs, make sure you've got this in place for your environment. Linda, can you tell me a little bit of what I'm looking at the bottom of the screen here about deny all?
I can. When you out of box, JD Edwards ships, as you said, Star Public is wide open. And whether that's your database access or it's your data access, what particular rows of data are available, or what applications organizations or individuals have access to that might have this confidential data that we're talking about. So we always talk about making sure that your security environment is locked down by default. So no one has access to data or programs unless they specifically are granted that access, which is exactly the opposite of what the way JD Edwards ships out of box. So there's a lot of organizations that they have that open, they start denying things that are most concerning, and then they realize they really need to flip that security model. If you are in a position that you need to go down that path, it can be intimidating, overwhelming, because there's a significant impact if you have issues with that flip. Just to make you aware, there are tools that can help with that. We've got some tools here, whether you're changing your data security from inclusive to exclusive, or from exclusive to inclusive, if you're changing your security model to deny all to keep people out of those programs that have this confidential data on it. And if you need guidance and help through that process, again, we've got the tools that can automate a lot of it, and ERP Suites has a lot of experience helping with those type of projects and supporting you in making that a reality. It really is possible, and you don't have to start from scratch and do it on your own. We've got tools that can really help. Paul?
Having done a couple deny all projects where we started from scratch, I have to say, this is absolutely huge. This could literally take months out of the project plan.
It does. I've done it too, where I've done denial before I was aware of the ALLOut tool set. I was a customer of ALLOut, and I had done the denial conversion before we purchased. And the amount of time that went into that and just testing and identifying every program access that was required, just these tools, I mean, nothing is foolproof. I'm not going to lie to anybody and tell you it's going to give you everything you need at the push of a button, but it's going to give you that 80%. So you spend a little bit of time managing exceptions and getting good information around a foolproof go live versus just spending so much of your time with the basics that leave gaps. So absolutely, it will help.
Interesting you said 80%. That's actually my personal motto, which is automate the 80. So the 80% that's common across everywhere, take advantage of what's already out there. Don't recreate it from scratch.
I agree.
So another thing to be concerned with is accessing tables outside of JD Edwards. So all of let's say you had ALLOut security and you do the deny all, but it's only going to really be applicable to what's happening from within the JD Edwards tool set where that security is being applied. You're going to be able to, if you have select access to the table, you're going to be able to see everything that's in there. You can do some data masking within the database itself to help limit some of that risk. So one other thing to think about as well is maybe you've got your production environment really locked down nicely and you don't have any concerns with that. But have you assessed the security risk associated with prototype and with development? So you're copying your transactional data down there periodically. Are you exposing data in those environments that you don't want to expose? Linda, any thoughts on this one?
From what I've experienced in my audit background, I would say at least 60 to 70% of your data breaches occur in those lower environments because your financial information is down there, your everything. When you think about doing a database refresh down to your PY environment or development environment to support testing and to support what's going on, you're copying people's social security numbers, you're copying banking information, you're copying credit card information, real financial data, real supply chain data is all going down there. So take the step of either encrypting that information in all environments. It's not just production that you need to protect, but encrypting the data, taking those key data points and replacing them with dummy data. So there may be a handful of data sets that you want to make sure that you go through and edit after the data refresh. Automate that process. It's the same ones you're going to want to do over and over again. Or making sure that you're masking that in a variety of other ways. Be aware, like you said a minute ago, that access comes in a variety of ways, whether it's an accountant who is trying to streamline journal entries and analysis. So somebody gives them access, Microsoft access to ability to directly connect to your JD Edwards tables. Just because you want them to be able to download journal entry information and manipulate it within Access doesn't mean they can't then point that to any of the tables that are within your JD Edwards environment. And in one situation I was working with, that accountant has great goals of streamlining their processes. So they're going to streamline their process and decided to go ahead and start pushing data back into those tables in JD Edwards from Microsoft Access. You've got
Linda, you just made my blood run cold. Microsoft Access updating data. You're losing all visibility to what happened.
your audit trail is gone. Be careful what you're allowing and make sure you're protecting data in those lower environments, as well as protecting that external access you were just talking about in all environments.
So we're going to have some contact information at the very end of this presentation, and we're not going to ask you to identify yourself publicly here on the webinar, But if you're using Microsoft Access to modify your JD Edwards data, contact me or Linda. You need an intervention.
We can help.
We can help. All right, so let's talk about another threat vector that we're concerned with, and that is the myopic executive. And what this is really about is when you're overly focused on short-term fiscal goals, ignoring long-term consequences. So maybe you're letting things go off maintenance because of CapEx or trying to reduce operational expenditures. Um, an example, we already talked about this before, dropping JD Edwards maintenance. So you're no longer getting those WebLogic patches, WebSphere vulnerabilities. You've got to balance the risk of dropping that maintenance against the cost to your organization, direct and indirect and reputational and everything else. And in reality, we recognize there are companies out there right now that 2020 was a brutal year for. You're barely hanging on, your financials are in tatters, and you did have to drop maintenance, and that's just the reality. And in all seriousness, we get it, we understand. But remove that external access from Enterprise One. If users do have to get in remotely over the internet, use something like Citrix, use something like terminal services to proxy those connections. That way, you're at least helping to protect against those WebLogic vulnerabilities. And as much as possible, make sure that the individual components, like the operating systems databases, are as current as you can get them based on the version of E1 tools that you're running. Another common exploit, and this one is really less about security, and it's more about availability. And this is where production and non-production are combined and running on the same servers. So what happens in this scenario is you got your monthly patching window, hopefully automated like we talked about before, but now you apply a patch to the system and there's a bug in the patch. We see this happen a couple times a year. And so, generally what will happen is the patch will come out 3 days later. Whoever released the patch will recall it. Well, if that patch is on your production system, you may have an extended outage related to that. Best practice is always have separate production and non-production systems. Patch non-production first. Let it burn in for at least a week before you apply it to production. Now, the only exception to that is if you have an out-of-band security patch that's being released that is currently being exploited in the wild. In those cases, in those exceptional cases, you might want to consider directly applying the patch to production. But otherwise, always non-production first, let it bake in, then apply it to production. So, Linda, can you talk about segregation of duties and kind of why this one's a big deal?
I can. When you start looking at the myopic executive or somebody who is just trying to get stuff done in the world that we've been in the last year and a half, we're all trying to do more with less people. Responsibilities are changing, and you get that. Just give that person whatever access they need. Get them. Don't get in the way of them doing their job. Well, what can happen from that is you've got employees that have responsibilities that are not appropriately segregated. And what that means are things like somebody can create a vendor and enter a voucher against that vendor. Somebody who can enter a purchase order and receive against that purchase order. If you're using the standard JD Edwards functionality to do evaluated receipts, now you've got a purchase order that's got the pricing and the receipt that's got the quantity, and it's going to automatically process through for payment. So you've got the opportunity where somebody can fraudulently create a transaction or typo something and make a mistake and go right through it. So there's human error and there's fraudulent activity that are all allowed when you don't have two sets of eyes and two sets of hands on a process. In this case, you're introducing that opportunity for somebody to, maybe they have a lot of financial threats at home. They've had somebody in their house with health problems. There's different financial implications in play on them, and there's pressures on them. And so, they've got the opportunity that they're in a bad place. Could they extract some additional financial support from your organization? You know what? Protect them from those pressures. Don't put them in a position that they have to make that decision. Go ahead, ensure that those responsibilities are spread across people. In this particular case, the mitigation is to have quick visibility where you may have segregation of duties violations that introduce risk to your organization. In this case, in this report, it's a quick matrix report that we make available. I can see that Katie has several places that she can perform both steps of a transaction, but that asterisk on the underneath payment and payment approval tells me that there's a mitigating control for that particular one, because there's going to be situations where you need somebody, you need your accounts payable manager to be able to make last minute vendor changes and enter vouchers. So you put a control in place that the accounting department reviews any changes that the accounts payable manager makes to the vendor master maintenance. Go ahead and indicate that, so you've got a control in place that's mitigating that risk. This report is a quick way to get visibility and understand, do you have risks within your segregation of duties process, because you just need that person to do their job. Paul?
Hey, Linda, as someone that had to basically build this by hand previously, where I tried to cobble it together with like object use tracking and a bunch of other stuff, literally what you're showing on the screen here, I mean, this is months of work. If a customer were to install this, about how long would it take them from installation to getting value?
When I purchased the ALLOut toolset and I implemented it for an organization as a customer, I went ahead, I got the software, I got their 80% again, the standard best practice rules that I needed to be looking at, adjusted it quickly for any custom applications I had, and I was able to generate a report like this over 3,000 users within the first day. So quick visibility, easy to see, and in reality, you can run this. For me, I did the same thing. It was taking us over 200 hours to manually do a segregation of duties review every time we did it. This report became something that just ran on scheduler or just was run quickly within 30 minutes to complete, again over 3,000 users. So it's take the simple approach and then spend that time on identifying your mitigating controls and getting that information. Get your 80% right out of box.
Very good advice. So moving on to our next threat vector, the deadly developer. Most individuals within companies running JD Edwards do not understand how powerful the developer is and the godlike access they have to everything. So I'll give you an example. So for instance, we've talked about how you could use ALLOut security and how you can use it to really lock down that JD Edwards environment. But within the JD Edwards framework, there is no security on business functions. So anyone that can authenticate to JD Edwards and has the IP address of the enterprise server could actually execute business functions against it, regardless of that security model. So an example would be the B98 OWSEC business function, where that can be used to reset the password of any account. And they can then use that password, log into the system, do whatever they want within JD Edwards, having the elevated permission of those particular users. So how do you mitigate against that? Or what is the mitigation? So separate systems for production, and the developer doesn't have access. And by separate systems, I mean separate installs. So you have one installation of JD Edwards, one deployment server. On it, you have all of your non-production environments. And then you have production completely isolated standalone. Now, it introduces complexity of management. So, things like OMW, you can't transfer your objects automatically into production. So you're having to export them out, import them, etc. But that extra layer of separation does buy you a lot of security benefits. Another thing to consider is restricting the enterprise server access to just IPs within the network that should be talking to it. So just because a device is in the network does not mean it should be allowed to talk to your enterprise server. And never, ever, ever publicly expose the IP address of your enterprise server. And if you're not using the XML kernel, disable it. Linda, can you talk about this next one?
Sure. When you're talking about the risk associated with developer access or developer processes, one of the things you've got is if there are the exploit of, are there inappropriate system updates or information happening as a result of development processes? So you ask for a change to the purchase order inquiry report, open purchase order report. The developer makes that change for you, but also adds a couple of other things that are going to move into production, where they get a copy of the positive pay file every time that it's run. Things like that can be buried into code changes that are happening. So you want to make sure to mitigate that, you want to make sure that you've got an appropriate SDLC process, system development lifecycle, that involves testing, reviews, sign off, really involves partnership between maybe your developers, your business analysts, your business process owners, so that when that report change is requested and you go through the process of testing that report change, make sure that you're looking at whether it's your business process owner or your developer or your business analyst that requested and documented the request, that they're looking at what are the objects that are being touched in this project? Are they appropriate? Are you doing real testing? Or are you just saying, hey, I don't care. I trust somebody, just get that into production, and you're just rubber stamping that approval on testing? You don't want to be there. Make sure that your individuals that are involved in testing and sign off understand the importance of the step that they are taking, and that they're doing real testing not just for positive results, is it giving me what I want, but is it doing anything else? And are there ways to look at that? Because it's very possible to add an extra line of code that rounds up every check over $10,000 and makes a deposit to their personal bank account, which is probably stored on their employee record. So go ahead and look for things like that as well in your testing processes.
Good advice, Linda. So moving to our next threat vector, and we've already talked about this a little bit, but the inside job, how people within your organization can be the weakest link. So we already talked about this a little bit as well. JD Edwards' model is too permissive. Linda?
You want to make sure that you're just utilizing that closed security model, making sure you're looking at how are users using the system. What are they doing? What screens are they using? Are they accessing information they shouldn't? And implement a security model that really restricts those users to what access they need, not just what it's easiest to grant them. Within reason. You don't want to create new security roles for everybody. You want to use best practice security roles and apply those and manage your security maintenance. But making sure that you're looking at those individuals and getting a security model that does lock down your confidential information. Once you do that, make sure that, again, it's not once and done. You're performing regular reviews, regular access reviews, to make sure that the right people have the right access. Because very frequently, somebody's going to call you and say, I need more access. They're not going to call and say, I don't have those responsibilities anymore. Please remove this. So in this particular case, it's just an example of a way to look at who all within my organization has the ability to do voucher entry? Are these the appropriate people that should be able to do that? I've got way too many people that can do depreciation and adjustments, and that can be problematic. Or maybe I don't have enough people that can do purchase order inquiry. I really need Greg to be able to do this. So do those quick reviews of, do the right people have the right level of access? Or even when you're working with security, do the right security roles have the right level of access? But make sure that you're doing, whether it's quarterly, annually, depending on how much change you have in your business, are people restricted to what they can do? There's two ways to utilize information like this. One is, do I have the right people able to perform the right functions? But remember, we're talking about data access here today. So have a list of what are all of my GDPR data points and who has access to those? Who has access to my red flag data? Who has access to personnel information or HIPAA information? And be able to report off of that and ensure that, oops, Jimmy changed jobs, but I never updated his access to make sure that he doesn't have data that isn't appropriate for him. Paul?
Hey, Linda, is this native JD Edwards functionality, or is this something provided by ALLOut?
This example I listed here is an ALLOut report, one of our delivered reports. We've got about 100 reports, or over 100 reports that come out of box, and this is one of those that you can run and get that quick visibility. There's a couple in our tool set that organizations use for those type of access reviews, user access reviews, and this is just one example.
Oh, fantastic. So another exploit to be concerned with is password sharing, and this is rampant across organizations. You need to make sure that's not happening, both from a security standpoint, but also from just an audit trail governance standpoint. Make sure that your corporate policy has consequences associated with if this is occurring. And a really good way of preventing it from happening is use of two-factor authentication. So that way someone might share the password, but it really doesn't matter because they're not going to have it on their phone to authenticate their identity. Any thoughts, Linda?
Yeah, probably the biggest area I've run into this over the years is in those executives that we've talked about, where they say, I want my admin to be able to sign on and do those purchase order approvals for me. You know what? Then go ahead and give them the access they need. Don't have them using your executives login, because that opens them up for access that you aren't aware that they have. And so just manage those and make sure you've got executive buy-in, because if you don't have a CFO or somebody that's going to support the importance of making sure that you're not sharing passwords, it's going to be really, really hard for your CNC or your security individual to try to enforce that. So you've got to have executive buy-in, because often it's the executives having their admins do something that's the biggest hole in this model.
So moving on to denial of service. And this is where legitimate users are prevented from accessing the system. So the scenario is a bad actor uses Google, uses Bing, finds the public URL for your system, and then they try to log in repeatedly with that JD Edwards user ID with the wrong password. So eventually JD Edwards locks out that system account, or the JD Edwards user ID. If you're using that as your system account, anyone else that's either relying on that for their backend user account, or if the JD Edwards services themselves are starting up as JDE, you basically just shut down your whole system. So how to mitigate that? We'll list a couple things here, but the bottom line is don't use JDE as your system account. Use something else. So let's go ahead and wrap up. So Linda, can you summarize things for us?
Sure. We've talked about a lot of different opportunities and things that you really need to do to manage security within your environment. So just to pull it back together, remember there is standard E1 functionality that you can be leaning on to help to help secure your environment, whether it's the security defaults, those staying current with the security patches, um, requiring requiring strong passwords and information, putting corporate policies in place. Make sure that you are monitoring, that you're looking for, do individuals have the appropriate access? Is segregation of duties being complied with? Are there key data components that are available to individuals and that are being accessed by individuals or system IDs? And then go beyond JDE Edwards. Go to your database, go to your external threats, make sure you're identifying those and mitigating those, and that it's more than production data. Don't forget that you want to be open to close in your production area, but when you start looking at PYDV, you have that same at-risk information from a supply chain area, from a competitive advantage, or from a compliance nature that are available in those other environments. So you want to protect those at all levels. And again, that top tip, don't assume because you checked it once, it's always good. Have an iterative process that's in place that you are cyclically looking at who has access to what, are your threats being addressed, what are your mitigating controls, are they still effective, and make that a part of your ecosystem within your organization.
So talk a little bit about how ALLOut helps empower this.
We've touched on a few things. Some of the modules, we have a subscription license, so you license what modules are appropriate for your organization or what can really help you at the current time. A few that we've talked about today are risk reporting, Profile Plus, Security Plus, and Start Out. I didn't spend a lot of time talking to Start Out, but it really can help in that open to close process or security redesign where we've got out of the box best practice security model already built that you can again apply and tweak as appropriate. But any of these, some of the reports that we've looked at, some of the ways to streamline and clean up information. If you want some additional information, there's product briefs that we've got available, or reach out and we can go through any questions you've got on any of these.
So speaking of reaching out, one of the things ERP Suites is offering is a free cloud assessment. So if you're actually looking at taking your JD Edwards environment and deploying it into the cloud, we can help you game out those options and make sure that you're doing it in a secure fashion. Also, if you're private cloud, you've got no plan of moving out to public cloud, we can help you with that as well. So before we get to that contact information, Linda, do we have any questions?
There is one question that's come in from the audience, and if anyone else has questions, please go ahead, enter those, and we'll address those here. But the question that we've got that's been presented so far is JDE. We've talked a lot about the JDE ID. Should it really be disabled in production, or does it need to stay open? Paul, I'm going to let you go ahead and address that.
So thanks. Yeah, so specifically with the JDE ID, you definitely want to disable it, but you need to do it in a very controlled fashion. So if you're relying on it for your JDE service or for JD Edwards itself to start under, you first need to change that to another ID. You also need to make sure that none of the individual users are using JDE as their system ID. So work with your CNC to determine if that's the case and put together a plan to help correct that. If you have any problems or questions about how to do it, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk with you or put you in contact with someone else from ERP Suites that can help you with that that specific detail. Oh, also, I have a not so much a question, but a comment from ERP Suites' own Frank Jordan, specifically going back to the developer and business function scenario. So Frank suggests that you monitor that B98 OWSEC business function via object use tracking to see who's using it. So it's not going to block anyone, but it at least gives you visibility to, is that being exploited? So thank you, Frank. That's a great call out. So how to get in hold of us. For ERP suites, reach out to us at findyourcloud@erpsuites.com. And you can use this if you want to schedule a free assessment, or if you just have a question about some of the content that we covered today in the webinar, especially thinking about you people that are using Microsoft Access out there. Definitely call us. We can help. Linda, what if they want to get a hold of you and at ALLOut?
If you have questions about anything that we've talked about here, or anything in nature, ALLOut really works to be an education partner in the security world within JD Edwards. So if you've got questions about anything we've talked about, reach out to me at info@alloutsecurity.com. We can schedule a demo of products, or we can just answer any questions that you've got. We're here to help. We really enjoy being a part of the community, and are willing to answer questions that you may have. So feel free to reach out to us.
So Linda, thanks so much for joining me today. This was a lot of fun, and great news. I heard that you and I will get to do this again at InFocus Deep Dive, as our session was selected and approved.
I'm excited about that. It's been great working with you, and we've gotten some good questions from the audience, and I hope we get even more at the next conference. So it'll be good to go through this topic again.
All right, on behalf of ERP Suites and ALLOut Security, thanks everyone for attending, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.